There's a lot of controversy these days in the United States centering around government universal health care. What is the government's role in providing universal health care? Should the government do it? Should it not? I'm not exactly sure what to think about universal health care and the government's role. I'm kind of dubious about the idea that universal health care will work in the United States, primarily because of our culture. I think that our culture is too enmeshed in sacrificial worldview. What do I mean by that? Well, it's this idea that the United States has a culture that prides itself on individualism. What do I mean by that? Well, it's this idea that you have had this success in your life primarily on your own. You've done this on your own. You've pulled up your own bootstraps and you've become successful. Yeah, maybe you've had a little bit of help along the way, but this is your doing. This is you. And so you deserve these things. You deserve universal health care. You deserve whatever other benefits that you've gotten because you've worked hard. Well, what does that mean for other people? Well, they haven't worked as hard as you. They haven't pulled up their own bootstraps. And that's their fault because they haven't worked as hard as you. Never mind that they haven't had the same community of support as you have. That doesn't really matter because you've done this on your own, so why can't they do it on their own? Thus, they don't deserve the things that you have. This is an implicit sacrificial worldview. It says, turn away from the suffering that you see because they don't deserve any help. I'm afraid that we are enmeshed in this idea of deserving things based on being successful, individual success. And so it kind of leads us away from being focused on providing for community. Well, if our culture is too enmeshed in this, where might we find hope? I want to argue that we find hope in the Abrahamic religions. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all look back to this patriarch Abraham and claim something about Abraham. What is that claim? What makes Abraham important? Well, it's nothing really specific about Abraham. It's more about a promise that God makes to Abraham. And you see it in Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 through 3. And here's what is written about Abraham. God says this, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse the one who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, when you hear that, there's this little bit about curse in there, right? The point about that is that the one who curses Abraham, it'll be God's job to curse. I have my own issues with this idea, but the point is that it's not Abraham's job to curse. It's Abraham's job to be a blessing. And it's the job of Abraham's descendants to be a blessing. How does this get played out in these traditions? Well, in Judaism, you have this experience of the ancient Israelites as they are coming out of Egypt, out of oppression, and they come into the desert. What happens there? Well, God provides. Out of God's abundance, God provides for the Israelites. Manna. This is both physical food for their physical bodies, sustenance for their bodies, and also it gets interpreted as spiritual food, spiritual sustenance. And God says, share with one another. There's enough for everyone. Just share. It's not about deserving it more than someone else. It's simply about sharing out of God's abundance. This is what, and for a while, the ancient Israelites do this in the desert. In the church, where do we see this in Christianity? In the book of Acts, you see the first church. And in the first church, everybody within the church shares with one another so that there is no one in need. People give of themselves to one another so that nobody is in need. It's not about deserving. It's about providing for the needs of one another. Why? Because God has brought us together to be a blessing. Where do we see this in Islam? Well, when in a surah it talks about when you receive your inheritance. When you receive your inheritance, if there are any widows or orphans amongst you, give a portion of your inheritance to them. This is spiritually, this is the inheritance that God gives you. Give to others. It even says, if there is anyone who is in need, whether they deserve it or not, whether you think they deserve it or not, provide. Give to them. Why? Because God will continue to provide for you. God will continue to make you a blessing. Trust in the promise of Abraham. This is what these people in these three traditions are called to do. Trust in the promise that God gives to Abraham to be a blessing to all of the families of the earth. The prophet Isaiah speaks about this. It reflects about this when he says to be a light to the nations. This is the job of the descendants of Abraham. Now, what happens? So often we get caught up in not just wanting our needs met, but wanting more and more and more. We get caught up in wanting to be the best, right? And we see this amongst the followers of these religions today. Well, like the argument goes, well, that religion is inherently violent and thus can never be a blessing, never be this promise to Abraham. And so let's just throw them away. Let's just speak these words of anger and towards them because they can't do it. And the other religion says, well, we're the latest religion. We're the true promise of Abraham. And so why don't you just join us? This is a rivalry that we get caught up into that has nothing to do with being the descendants of Abraham. We're not being a blessing to one another. We're speaking words of competition to one another, words of violence to one another. That's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to challenge one another to really be the descendants of Abraham, to challenge ourselves to be the descendants of Abraham so that we will be a blessing to all of the families of the earth. If we did this, if we lived this out, if we challenged one another to live into this idea of being a blessing to all the families of the earth, we wouldn't have this problem of universal health care. These Abrahamic religions would provide for the needs, not only within themselves, but the needs outside of themselves. So to be a blessing to a light to the nations, as Isaiah says. So those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks.